It's always a great sign when a video is inspired by a Reddit thread, but you know what? Here we are. Hi, I'm Sydney. It's 7 in the morning. My pronouns are they, them. I'm a disability historian. We make videos primarily about disability and disability-related things in just about every category of life on this channel. This is not quite that, but LGBTQ plus history is disability history for much of human times. This is adjacently within my expertise, and also intersectionality exists, so I cover this a lot in other ways, and the themes are often identical, especially around representation. Not that I even need to defend my academic right to speak about this, because I also just am non-binary, but I do have academic expertise that works here. Now, not to out myself immediately, but I have a Reddit account, and I use it, I lurk exclusively, and I almost exclusively lurk on r/Broadway as a subreddit, because that's like the only place where there is online and thus citable discussion about the minority world of theater. There's many shows that I've done formal analyses for where the only direct sources on the disability conversation around it, outside of my own opinions, have to be from that subreddit. It's the only place I can find any sourcing. So I am often lurking on there to see what's going on, to see what kind of discussions are happening. Sometimes I find disability shows via people talking about them, and then I go to see them afterwards. Floyd Collins was an example of that. And I was scrolling through what's going to be, I think, about 2.5 or 3 weeks before you see this, because I wanted to wait for the show to open before commenting on it. I follow reviewer etiquette. I saw a post by a user called Trans Shake Nerd, and it was titled "A Trans Person's Take on Dog Day Afternoon," and I was fascinated. And I was scrolling through the comments and reading everybody's opinions, and I saw a lot of people arguing that, like, well, of course it's transphobic. It takes place in the 70s. It would be anachronistic to change that to fit 2026 standards. Or of course it's transphobic. It's based on a true story, so it would be wrong to change it to be not transphobic because that's not the reality of what happened. Or, of course it's transphobic. This play was written a long time ago. It wasn't. And so the real question is, why are we choosing to revive this show right now? This is a world premiere, it's not a revival. Now, mostly these were coming from folks who self-described as not being trans, as not having seen either movie or play, or saw the movie like a decade ago, and or don't know a lot about media representation, so they were missing all of the pieces needed to have a full, nuanced conversation. And I wanted to jump into that conversation because, again, most of the arguments were not based on the full breadth of understanding I believe is required to have that kind of argument. Editing Sydney here, I want to caveat that a little bit. If you go see something and you feel like, that was misogynistic, that was racist, that was transphobic, whatever. That gut feeling is valid and worth having a conversation about, and you are allowed to talk about having that feeling. I'm more talking about here that there were a lot of people in the comments of this Reddit thread that were defending the show's use of theoretical transphobia that they didn't know about because they hadn't seen, based on other information they also did not know. So when I'm talking about needing to have the full breadth of information to have this conversation, I'm saying that in the sense of having a conversation that defends potentially its portrayal of a minority person, not in the sense of you're not allowed to have any opinion on the show at all unless you have, you know, a degree and the knowledge of the entire source material and history of this story. That's not what I'm saying at all. Just specifically that I was like, well, this conversation isn't very productive because nobody actually knows what they're talking about. So yeah, but if you saw it and felt icky, that is just as valid as all of the information I'm about to give you in this video, and I want to make sure that's pretty clear. Also, I don't comment online, really ever, even anonymously. It kind of freaks me out. For as much as my job is being visible online, I hate being visible online. And B, I'm a scholar. I know better than to pretend I know about something that I do not know about. Tommy has taught us a lesson on this channel. So, today's deep dive was born, where you get to learn about the real bank heist and the 2 attempts at retelling the story of said bank heist, and we can decide whether we think Dog Day Afternoon is transphobic. And the answer is, it depends on which one you're talking about. Now, some housekeeping things to get out of the way before we dive in. I already did my introduction. We will skip that. If you want to see more deep dives like this, I have a playlist of in-depth disability theater analyses linked below in the description for you. Also, while you're down there, you'll find the link to my source list if you want to read more, as well as my Patreon if you want to support me to be able to make more content like this. I am currently planning a trip to London at the end of the month that you're seeing this in, for the specific purposes of analyzing something for this series, and I will not even make the cost of the show's ticket back in AdSense from that video, much less plane fare, hotels, all of that kind of stuff. So any support is very much appreciated. And also, if you want to see what that involves, feel free to subscribe, leave a comment, hit any other buttons below so the algorithm can bring you back here. I'd love to have you. Also, for folks who need it, I'm a white young person with light brown, just beyond shoulder length curly hair that I really need to get cut. I'm wearing a white button-up shirt that has little teal flowers on it. It's short sleeve and the sleeves are cuffed, but you can't really see that because of the framing. I'm sitting on a dark gray couch in front of a plain wall, and above my head are some green leaves and and some fairy lights. Also, content advisory, there will be some mentions of attempts on one's own life and associated ideation. Sorry to be vague about that, but you know the censorship rules. Domestic violence and some outdated language around trans people, but we will be doing all of the above thoughtfully and as minimally as possible. I just want to give you a heads up. This is also written in the same spirit as my other media deep dives, where our goal is to not point fingers at any specific people because no one person is ever solely responsible for narrative issues, but instead look at the overall flawed system on which the theater industry is built and how that leads to certain things happening that we can acknowledge and learn from. Okay, so Dog Day Afternoon as a film was released on the 21st of September 1975. This is notably almost exactly 3 years after the actual bank heist the film is based on took place, which is an impressive turnaround, I must say. We're gonna get into the plot after I go through the history here, but just for some context, if you have like no idea what's going on here, it tells the story of a guy who goes to rob a Brooklyn bank to get money to pay for his wife's gender-affirming surgery, referred to at the time as a sex change operation, and does an impressively poor job of it, and so it turns into a major hostage situation, and he comes out as this sort of bumbling, almost Robin Hood-like figure that you kind of root for. Real guy, not so much, but I won't get ahead of myself. So the film came out in 1975, both a critical and box office success. It made $50 million on its $4 million budget. It received 7 Golden Globe nominations, 6 BAFTA nominations, winning for editing and for Al Pacino, who played the head robber, who he won for Best Actor, and 6 Academy Award nominations, winning for Best Original Screenplay. Chris Sarandon notably would receive a nomination for his portrayal as the trans woman character, which is an early example of non-minority actors receiving praise for portraying minorities. That aside, I still think the nomination was very much earned, especially for what I believe was his first ever film. But like, of course, that's a complicated ethical situation, but his performance was fantastic. Trans actress Elizabeth Coffey Williams was considered for this role, but they concluded she was too attractive and too female to play a trans woman, despite being one. So that's awesome. It was directed by Sidney Lumet, who you may know as the guy responsible for films such as A View from the Bridge, Long Day's Journey into Night, Equus, Murder on the Orient Express, and The Wiz. He was also a Broadway actor prior to being a director, which really shines through in his direction because I always find it focuses so much on the people and gives their performances a lot of room to breathe. The screenplay was by Frank Pearson, who you may know as the director of the 1976 A Star is Born, and it was based on the September 1972 article in Life magazine titled The Boys in the Bank by P.F. Klug and Thomas More. That being said, much of the screenplay would be rewritten via improvisation once the film was actually being made, which arguably is what made it good, but we'll talk about that in a bit. It has no score, so it feels very documentary style almost, just kind of following the events of the day. It's a real slow burn of a film. It takes a good while to really dig into and be like, I like this, but by doing that, it gives a lot of space for the characters to really develop and show who they are, which gets you really invested by the final act. I felt like at the beginning, I couldn't tell if it was trying to be a comedy or not because it wasn't funny enough to be like laugh out loud funny, but also the circumstances were comical. But then as things wore on and the stakes got higher, it really balanced itself out, and it was cool to see that slow emotional shift, not unlike how the actual hostages felt in real time. I really enjoyed it. I will be watching it again at some point. It's a very unique piece of cinema, and why anybody looked at this and went, that's gotta be put on stage, really beats me. I have the way this film works is so lightning in a bottle with its production and its team, and also the feelings of the time period both in which it was set and in which it was filmed, that I don't think that can actually be replicated in any medium meaningfully. Not that stage adaptations should ever replicate their source material, they should build on it and do something new with it, but this film particularly, I don't know how it could work beyond like a Tectonic Theater Project style meta-documentary analysis that perhaps analyzes the source material and the time period and its impact on top of telling the original story. It's just that sometimes I will like watch a movie and I'll be like, oh, that would be interesting on stage, or like I see why that's been adapted into other stuff. And there was not a single piece over the course of this entire 2 hours that I ever once thought that. But we'll return to that after I see the play. Casting for this movie was also interesting because the original article described the leading robber as having the looks of an Al Pacino or a Dustin Hoffman, which is what sparked the idea for the movie in the first place. And Pacino was initially brought on, then he said never mind, then he was brought on again, then he said never mind. He's very into like the method, and this character is gay, and he was like, maybe I don't want to do that. And then Dustin Hoffman expressed interest in the role, and then Pacino took the role. He had recently skyrocketed to stardom because of The Godfather and was kind of in this weird place about it. Like, you don't want to work on a project where you're supposed to be playing just some underdog kind of guy and like everybody on set looks at you like you're a famous god. That's not ideal for like a good performance and is also deeply disconcerting as a human person. So he decided to get a lot of close friends and people he had worked with off Broadway to fill out much of the main cast. Like the woman who played his mother is one of the co-founders of the Living Theater, for example. Like the cast is a lot of people that you don't see in film very often, but when you start Googling them, you're like, whoa, your bio is crazy. You just all did theater. But that theatrical backing and thus improvisation backing also really contributed to making this film what it was, because everybody was so skilled at riffing and character and locking into a live performance kind of vibe, which made it incredibly real and grounded. A combination of this film and the real historical event also changed how police train around hostage negotiations and policing when crowds form around a crisis. This is also one of the first films to have a bisexual or pansexual protagonist and marked a huge step forward for queer narratives on screen in quite a few directions. Unfortunately, a lot of that progress would backtrack the following decade due to Reagan, but at the time, despite trepidation from the queer community around this film, there was great hope about what kind of era of representation it might usher in. In 2009, the film was selected by the Library of Congress for preservation in the National Film Registry, and in 2016, it was announced that there was going to be a Dog Day afternoon play produced by Warner Brothers, which would then not happen until this year, opening on Broadway on March 30th at the August Wilson Theater. Directed by Rupert Gold, who is an Olivier Award-winning director and has been the artistic director of the Almeida for a hot minute, and I believe is about to become the artistic director of the Old Vic. Let me cross-check that and make sure I didn't say that incorrectly. Yes, he is the outgoing artistic director of the Almeida and the incoming artistic director of the Old Vic. I very much associate his name with Shakespeare. I don't know if that's how everybody else thinks of him as a director, but I also must mention his most recent direction on Broadway was Tammy Faye, and the play is written by Stephen Adly Guirgis, the 2015 Pulitzer winner for his play Between Riverside and Crazy. Oh, also, if you're seeing this play and you need any sensory warnings for it, like wear flashing lights and all of the gunshots are, as well as other accessibility information like where the bathrooms are located. I made an accessibility review for this production, as I do for everything that I see with all that info. That will be linked below for you, and it's also on my Instagram by this point. Now, the film, after opening credits, begins with three guys climbing out of a car in front of a Brooklyn bank, and the leader of the group is named Sonny Wartzik. He's played by Al Pacino. Hilariously, the last name is one of the butchered pronunciations of John Wadowitz's name from the media at the time, which I think is a cool tidbit. Might have been completely accidental, but that's something I picked up on, at least. Then there's a guy named Salvatore. He goes by Sal. He's played by the late John Cazale, and a guy named Stevie. And they go into the building, and Stevie immediately panics and he's like, I can't do the heist, and he dips. And then they also try to cover up the cameras, but Sonny is too short, so he has to jump and kind of try his best, and he fumbles getting the gun out of the box that he hid it in on his way into the bank, and so it's just like everything immediately goes wrong. The workers bring Sonny to the safe so he can take the money that Sonny assumes has just been delivered via armored truck based on the tip that he was given, but it turned out that the truck had just left with most of the bank's cash, and so there was in fact very little money for them to take. But they take everything that they can, and then Sonny chooses to burn the register in a trash can rather than taking it with him to destroy it later, which immediately alerts somebody outside because now there's smoke in the building, and so police start to arrive, and Sal and Sonny, knowing the police are coming and they're about to be trapped, decide they're just going to take everybody hostage and shove them all into the vault and then leave really quickly, but then one of them has to pee, and Sonny's really nice, so he decides he's going to let her go to the bathroom first, but then everybody else has to pee, and it's just like a whole thing, and that stalls them even longer, and then they get kind of stuck in the building because it becomes surrounded by hundreds of police. As the hostage situation really begins, Sonny threatens on the phone to the police he's going to kill all the hostages if he has to. He's going to start, throwing bodies and whatever. He tries to be all macho, but he clearly has absolutely zero intention of actually doing so. Meanwhile, Sal is like, hey, if you need me to, I'm ready. Let's go. And Sonny's like, okay, we'll deal with that later. Don't worry about it. And then the building security guard begins to have an asthma attack, and so Sonny decides to release him so that he can go get medical help, but the now surrounding building immediately assumes this black security guard is one of the instigators and tries to take him down, and Sonny and one of the other hostages get incredibly angry at their ignorance and their lack of care. Sonny begins to worry that these cops are very trigger happy and they're likely to be blown to smithereens. As we'll talk about later, this was something that was happening very commonly in this time period, so it was very top of mind for everybody, and as a crowd forms outside, he gets them on his side by reminding them of the recent Attica prison riot where many innocent people were killed by trigger-happy officers. I must mention, because every film snob will be angry if I don't, that moment was completely improvised. Everybody in the bank also gets excited about being on the news. They give interviews over the phone, including Sonny. One of the women's husbands keeps calling to ask questions about how to make dinner and how to take care of the kids and wondering when the heist is going to be over so she can come home and deal with it. Things are relatively low stakes, but they're also obviously incredibly high stakes. Now, well into formal hostage negotiations with a guy named Eugene Moretti, Sonny says he wants them to bring his wife to the bank and he wants a vehicle vehicle to bring them to the airport so they can board a jet going wherever they want. And then they cut to footage of his wife who's juggling 2 children, only for us to learn that actually the wife Sonny is referring to is his second wife, a trans woman by the name of Leon Shermer. She was recently hospitalized at Bellevue after making an attempt on her own life, and when she arrived, she is still under the influence of some of the medications the doctors put her on, presumably to calm her down. There's some sort of tranquilizer situation, and she's also still in her hospital gown with kind of disheveled hair and is just overall really disoriented. She refuses to see Sonny, instead brought to the barber shop where the police have made a temporary headquarters, and speaks to Sonny on the phone. We learn from him that the heist was to pay for her gender reassignment surgery, and the two of them have an absolutely heartbreaking conversation where we learn Leon is terrified of Sonny and thinks that he's going to kill her, but there's also clearly some feelings still lingering and how angry she is for having him put her in this position. Now they're questioning if she's an accomplice, and she turns down his offer of her to escape with him on their planned airplane situation and asks him to clear her name because the police now believe that she has put him up to it for her surgery. Sonny also misgenders her for the entire film. This is kind of important. Sonny then negotiates pizza for the hostages to make sure that they are fed, also releasing cash into the crowd, after which the diabetic bank manager has a bit of a health issue but refuses to leave everybody else, even though Sonny very much offers. The lights are cut off, as is the AC, to turn up the pressure and try to end the holdup, making everybody hot and miserable. I forgot to mention this. It's called Dog Day Afternoon because it was in August and it was really, really, really hot. That's kind of important. Sonny's mother shows up and tries to convince him to just give up and come home, but he refuses, and then he dictates his will to one of the hostages, planning his life insurance to go to Leon to cover the surgery, and then the rest to his first wife for her and the kids. And he talks about both of his wives with so much love and care and how they are like his, soulmates, despite actively misgendering Leon the entire time, which is really, really interesting. And then they all as a unit get into the bus provided to bring them to the airport. The driver instructs Sal to keep his gun pointed at the sky so he doesn't accidentally kill the driver should they hit a bump. And the robbers start to feel like, oh, maybe they've really gotten away with it. They get to the airport, they watch the plane taxi toward them. Sonny asks if there's going to be food on the plane, and then in a split second, one agent has grabbed Sonny's gun while the other shoots Sal in the head with a revival hidden in the car door.
The word there was supposed to be revolver. I don't know where revival came from. Sorry about that.
And the hostages run out of the vehicle to safety. Sonny is arrested, Sal's body is wheeled away, and then we get the text on screen that says Sonny has been sentenced to 20 years in prison, his first wife and his kids are trying to live on welfare, and Leon now lives as a woman in New York City. And that is the end of the movie. While the film ostensibly focuses on this failed heist, it points to a lot of really big ideas in society at the time. The issues of police brutality with things like the Attica prison revolt and the Kent State shootings, both instances where absolute undue force was used against innocent people. The Vietnam War ended in 1973, which was incredibly unpopular for its entire duration, and also so many veterans were coming home in need of psychiatric and medical care they were then not able to receive, because unlike in other wars where when veterans come home there's an expansion of disability benefits because the economy, they chose not to do that post-Vietnam, also because there was shame about Vietnam, so veterans were not being taken care of, and it was also a war people were ashamed of, so people were kind of ignored. It was like a whole, just a mess. This was also before PTSD was added to the DSM, but of course discussions of shell shock had been ongoing for over 50 years, so there was definite awareness of it to some degree, and we see some of this noted in the film with the immediate concern the police are going to kill everybody, the rallying cry of remembering Attica, that is often the only thing people know about this movie apparently, and they mention on multiple occasions that Sonny is a Vietnam veteran. I forget if Sal is too. In real life, Sal was a child, so he was not. There was a lot of sentiment at the time about disliking the man and like rooting for the little guy, about corruption existing within every facet of those in power. And so while we today are rooting for Sonny, when this film came out, that sentiment was even stronger. My one main critique of the movie is it did Sonny/John's first wife dirty, insinuating that he left her because she'd gotten fat and boring and he wanted the exciting piece of the queer world. Not that he had left her long prior and then met this trans woman. There was a bit of narrative clarity that I feel was missing, that I also think would have made Sonny's characterization a bit clearer. Regarding queer narratives, some sources say that there was a direct gay consultant for the script. Others say that it was just approved of by the National Gay Task Force after the fact. Genuinely unclear, I can't find it in either direction, but the task force director at the time referred to the representation as being sensitive and tasteful. The original screenplay intended for it to be a lot campier, and there was a moment where Leon arrived, I believe dressed as like Marilyn Monroe, and the two of them kissed in front of the bank, and Al Pacino got in a massive fight with the creative team about it because he felt that was completely out of character for both of them, and also not at all consistent with the original historical story, and he wanted to stay closer to that. A lot of the campiness of the script was pulled back significantly due to Pacino's arguments about what felt more true to the characters and how they would live their lives, which ended up in a much more realistic and humanized representation, unlike what was standard in film at the time, especially noting that homosexuality was removed from the DSM as a mental disorder in 1973, 2 years prior to this film's release, and homosexual activity would not be legalized in New York until 1980. Scholars have argued that it's a bit of a narrative problem that Sonny's queerness is used as a sort of big twist or a reveal, but at the same time, it's also notable that said reveal doesn't actually change anything. Like, unlike the standard in media at the time and even today, this was a character who just happened to be gay, and that wasn't really even in the top, like, 3 important things about who he was as a person. Same with Leon to some extent, actually. She feels very grounded and very real, and once you get used to the circumstances, you really see her as an entire person who is in a really tough spot. It is remarkable how the performer and filmmakers make a figure that typically would have been caricatured and exoticized at the time have their own sense of purposeful self-worth. Sonny and Leon's relationship is played to the media in the film as it was in real life, as believe it or not stuff. Yet the movie allows that it makes sense to them, conferring the viewer's respect, even though their paths are diverging while we watch. There's been more recent comment about frustration around Leon's character being written as neurotic and frail and overly feminine, but based on A, the circumstances this character was in at the time, and B, all of the interviews I've watched of Liz Eden, who this is based on, these choices make a lot of sense to me. I think we can acknowledge that certain traits have historically been harmful stereotypes around trans women, and also can be true and accurate in specific instances, like both things can be true at once. One critique from the time and now that I do very much agree with, however, is there's a photo of Liz when she's being taken to the bank that the costume and hair team did a fantastic job replicating almost exactly for Leon. I will put the original photo on this side and the film photo on this side so you can see, but the exception is that they chose to give her a 5 o'clock shadow, which many people feel robbed her of some kind of dignity and an important aspect of her womanhood, which I do not disagree about. But speaking of Liz, let's talk about the real botched bank heist. It took place on August 22nd, 1972 at a Chase Manhattan Bank branch on East 3rd Street in Brooklyn. It's no longer there if you were planning to go visit it. I don't know why you would. It's a bank. Around 3 or 3:30 p.m., close to closing time, 3 dudes named Salvatore. He is the only one whose name is preserved in the film. He was 18 years old. He spent his life in and out of institutions for various small crimes. Bobby Westenberg, age 20, who bailed almost immediately. And John Wadowitz, age 27, the one played by Al Pacino, waltzed into this bank and waited until the last customer had left before taking hold of the bank for their intended heist. They managed to botch not 1, not 2, but 3 bank heists earlier the same day, so 4th time simply had to be the charm. Now, before we can get into the timeline of that day, we do need to talk about John. At the time, he was known as Little John Basso, Basso being his mother's maiden name, and Little John referencing his dick size. A name he chose, and by all accounts, seems very proud of. I will not be calling him that. I refuse. He also changed his nickname so many times, it's not like I'm respecting a chosen name anyway. Not that he would understand the concept of respecting a chosen name regardless, so. The screenwriter went and interviewed lots of people who had known John, and everybody gave the screenwriter conflicting reports, with the only consistent description being that he let everybody down. That was like the main thing that everybody agreed upon. John grew up in New York. He worked in various city banks, and there he met his first wife, Carmen. Her family would not allow her to marry him before he went off to fight in the Vietnam War. She says she thinks it's because they hoped he wouldn't return, but fortunately or unfortunately he did. They were married in 1967. They had 2 kids together. He then left her 2 years later and began frequenting gay bars. He also joined the Gay Activists Alliance, which he admits to having joined almost exclusively to be his own personal cruising grounds. There's a documentary about him. It's called The Dog. It came out in 2013. It's a slightly maddening watch. I can't recommend it. We'll talk about that later, but in it he refers to people almost exclusively in terms of the people that he could get and his number of lays, and he has a very strong pattern of getting people who are objectively vulnerable, like newly out gay men going to the GAA to try to find community, people in need of food and housing, people a lot younger than him, etc. He was not well liked within the alliance by any means, but anyway, he meets a woman by the name of Elizabeth Eden. She was born Ernest Aaron. I'm only noting that dead name to connect historical records. She will be referred to as Liz henceforth, unless I'm quoting something from the era. They had a whirlwind romance. They decided they wanted to get married, but legally could not be. This was a time when trans people were considered to be their gender assigned at birth legally until they had gone through all aspects of a medical transition, which she had not, and so she could not legally marry a man. Also, John had never divorced Carmen, and it would also go to hers multiple nights a week all through his relationship with Liz, so at this point, I think it's just polygamy and or polyamory, whichever one you want to decide it is, because they weren't legally. Anyway, so Liz told Father John, a gay-friendly priest, which was something incredibly common at the time. The Catholic Church had a moment where a lot of sections of it became really liberal, and then that died. Conversation for another day. That she was feeling really despondent that she was not able to marry the man that she loved, to the point where she had contemplated making unsafe choices. And so Father John, wanting to do everything he could to save her life, said, I can't formally marry you guys, but I can bless a union between two persons, and you are two persons. And so John empties his savings. He borrows money from some loan sharks, bookmark that for later, to buy her the most extravagant wedding dress and have a whole fancy wedding on December 4th, 1971. All of the bridesmaids were in drag, as was written about at the time. They may have also been otherwise gender nonconforming in some manner. The couple's parents came, and it became known as New York's first drag wedding. It was covered in a 4-page spread of Drag Magazine, a trans-Pacific magazine, and it was filmed. In fact, it was mentioned on Walter Cronkite at the time. Father John either left the priesthood after this or was formally excommunicated by the church for this. Sources vary. John, the groom John, not Father John, was hoping that by putting out a donation till at the wedding, they would be able to get their guests to cover all the money they had spent on it, which was very much not the case. Again, we will earmark that for later. Shortly after the wedding, things immediately become toxic between Liz and John, with her wanting nothing more than to get a sex change operation. Again, I'm going to refer to that as a gender-affirming surgery. I don't know if she was just referring to bottom surgery or what entirely that entailed, but she did not have the money for it. It was about $2,700 at the time, which is about $21,000 today. And also, John absolutely refused to bless it in any regard. He insisted on using Liz's dead name and male pronouns for her until the end of his life. Not even the end of her life. He definitely misgendered her at her own funeral. He would refer to her as his wife, but would otherwise never once gender or name her correctly, which is just wild to me, not just because of the abject disrespect, but also it seems like she was relatively socially transitioned at the time and would have introduced herself to him as Liz. So I don't even know how, was he calling her Liz when he first met her and then figured out what her dead name was and switched? I have a lot of questions. Anyway, so he was afraid that he would feel differently about Liz after her surgery and did not under any circumstance want her to go through with it, even if she did have the money to do so. He also often flew into rages, and at one time in April he beat her so badly that she left him, but then he kept showing up at her workplace and mailing her letters trying to force her to come back to him. On the evening of her birthday the following August, she would try to take her own life via sleeping pills and was taken to Kings County Hospital. The next day, John would go to visit her and, according to him, learned from the doctors that they thought she was very mentally ill and unstable and would not be leaving the institution anytime soon, scheduling her for electroshock therapy and presumably other kinds of attempted conversion treatment of some kind. And so, again, according to him, he decided then and there he's going to do whatever he can to try to spring her out of that hospital and pay for her surgery to keep her alive. And so that's why he decided to do a bank heist the next day, according to him. But also at the same time, he has said that he had, at a gay bar at one point, heard from somebody who worked at Chase Manhattan about the schedule in which the armored trucks came to deliver truckloads of cash, and so that's why he tried to do the heist the following day. And yes, that timeline does not add up. Bear with me, we're getting there. So the heist happens, right? 2 days after she's institutionalized. The night before, he and his 2 accomplices went to see The Godfather in theaters as inspiration, and then the next day they set out on their crime spree. The first attempt was at a bank at the corner of Delancey and Essex. They get out of the car, one of them drops their shotgun, which then immediately goes off and everybody stares at them, so they get back in the car and they speed off. The second attempt was in Queens, and they immediately ran into one of their mom's friends who recognized them and asked what they were up to. And then the third one, they decided to practice driving the getaway car around the block real fast to get out and accidentally ran into another car. And the driver of that car was really angry and threatened to call the police, who would, of course, search the car and find the weapons and the ransom note. So that was bad. So then they booked it from that one and they decided to go to a fourth bank because luck was on their side at this point. They waltz into the bank. The last customer leaves. Sal slips a note to the cashier that says, and I will put the actual photo of the note on screen right now. "Dear sir, please try to relax and stay calm as you read this note. No harm will come to you if you do exactly as you are told. This is a holdup. There is a bomb in the bag at my feet. If triggered, the whole building and half of the block will go up. The lives of all of us depends on your actions and the others present. Take the vault keys and accompany us to the conference room. We will follow you. We are heavily armed and will not hesitate to kill anyone who does not do exactly as they are told. Complete cooperation is the only course. There is no reason for anyone to be injured or killed. It is all up to you. This is an offer you can't refuse." Also, for blind and low vision viewers who can't see the ransom note that I just put on screen, there's a lot of typos in it, and not just in the sense of like using a typewriter is hard and you can't really fix it the way that you can with a computer, but in the sense of like not knowing grammar rules kind of thing, which, not judging, I'm just pointing out that feels like an important piece of the puzzle a little bit. Anyway, at this point, Bobby immediately bails. He is out of there. And unfortunately, they were correct. the armored truck was coming to the bank earlier that day. But the truck was not there to drop off cash, but instead to pick up most of it. So there wasn't really any cash for them to take. John fills the briefcases with anywhere from $29,000 to $38,000, depending on which source you read, which feels like a large space between those numbers, but sure. And then while this is going on, the bank manager has been on the phone with somebody from another branch who quickly realizes his colleague is talking kind of strangely and is like, hey, is everything good over there? You're talking weird. And the bank manager responds, not at all. Good day, and hangs up the phone. So that colleague promptly sends cops to the bank, who immediately surround it because they have no idea what's going on inside. They don't know if there's like a million gunmen in there and what the level of danger is, so they just bring every single police officer to ever exist and surround the building. With no way of escaping now that the building is surrounded, John turns it into a 14-hour-long hostage situation, keeping the 6 lady teller, security guard, and bank manager stuck in the bank with him and Sal. John does allow them bathroom and unlimited phone privileges, so many of them call their spouses, have a relatively chill time, at least in terms of how chill it can be when one is in an active hostage situation. A crowd also begins to build outside, eventually ending up at a size around 2,000 people or so. John realizes that at risk of police brutality, if he keeps all eyes on them, they are less likely to die because nobody wants to see anybody killed on live television. Attention and film cameras trained on them was their safety blanket. So as press begins calling the bank, he picks up the phone, he starts giving interviews over the phone. He also starts introducing himself as Big John now. One of the first requests he makes in the hostage negotiations is the release of his wife, the specific quote being, I want them to deliver my wife here from Kings County Hospital. His name is Ernest Aaron. It's a guy. I'm gay. He tells people in his phone interviews that the whole heist is to pay for her operation, and that is why he's doing it. Now, 26-year-old Liz Eden is brought to the scene, still in her hospital gown and on various medications given to her at the hospital, so she's, again, very disoriented. John releases the guard in exchange for her arrival. He doesn't have any health issues like we see in the film. Liz is terrified. She is convinced that he's officially gone off his rocker and he wants her in the bank so that he can kill her, and she refuses to go anywhere near the building, and so she's instead brought into the barber shop nearby that had become the sort of de facto police headquarters. John assumes that Liz's refusal to see him is actually secretly an FBI trick, and he literally cannot fathom the concept of her not wanting to see him for any reason. They talk on the phone and she refuses to have anything to do with him at all whatsoever. She kind of stands her ground, so that ends up being deeply unsuccessful and really throws John for a loop. A historical note that is really important is the mainstream media at the time tends to gender her correctly more often than not and does refer to her as his wife. It's not perfect by any means, but they have a much better hit rate than her own husband does, and it's actually kind of great. There's one interview with a head official, I think FBI dude there, where she is misgendered a singular time, but you can clearly tell on the face of the man speaking, he's putting in a lot of effort to try to gender her correctly and flip what his brain is saying about this person that he has met to respect her pronouns, and the one time he didn't, he just kind of gets mixed up in his words, which for the time is really impressive and really noteworthy, and frankly still the level of gendering we see on the news today. My initial assumption when I heard about the misgendering issues in the play was that it wasn't all that uncommon at this time to not use, say, she, her pronouns for a trans woman until she had had surgery, and otherwise just considered her a drag queen or a crossdresser until that time. And that is how the Village Voice, which is a Greenwich Village specific publication, talked about Liz at the time in this era, but it seems like Liz herself had more or less socially transitioned, at least within the community. It was more or less viewed as a trans woman. There were still cross-dressing laws in place, so she was not allowed to wear dresses out in public, but she dressed as functionally lesbian, I guess, as she possibly could, that would fit within the laws of what AMAP people were legally allowed to wear, but would feel more gender affirming to her. It's hard to be entirely sure if the community viewed her as a woman or as a drag queen or crossdresser or whatever, because many accounts at the time are done with quite some delay, so I can't tell if that's people retroactively talking about her beforehand, using her proper name and pronouns that she would later choose, but I'm fairly sure they had been the case for her since before she met John. And the media, again, was generally able to gender her correctly, with the exception of news outlets that wanted to freak showify the event and thought of her as some sort of curiosity more than a human person, but that was the minority, which is really cool, especially for, 1972. The news also, in talking about the story, showed footage of their wedding and talked a bit about gay and transgender issues in a way the gay community had been trying to force them into doing for quite some time, which led to some really mixed feelings because John was not well liked in the community. We'll get to that. Anyway, so after the failure of getting Liz into the bank, he calls his friend Pat Coppola, who meets him at the door. The two of them make out in the doorway, the crowd erupts. He also negotiates for hamburgers to feed himself and the hostages, becoming very angry that the FBI shows up with pizzas instead, and he did in fact throw money out the door of the crowd. That is a real thing that happened. Over the course of the holdup, multiple hostages were given the active choice to run, and they chose to stay. Like, there truly was a moment where John found out the bank manager had diabetes and offered to send him to go see a doctor if he needed insulin or something, but he was like, nah, I'm fine. I'll stay, don't worry about it. At some point they kind of felt bad for these failed robbers, and they like created this really weird community vibe in the bank, so everybody just kind of stuck it out. John's plan, once they got to the hostage negotiation part, was to force them to bring him and Sal and Liz to Kennedy Airport, along with all the hostages, releasing one at each step along the way, until it was just the three of them flying off to Denmark to escape and also get her surgery, which, like, extradition laws exist. I don't know why they thought this was going to be successful, even if they got to Denmark, but sure. Also, obviously, Liz is not joining into this plan. She will have no part in this because she is a reasonable human person. Around 3:30 in the morning, the FBI agree to the airport limo, hoping there's going to be some sort of critical failure in the transferring of everybody from the bank to the car so they can use that as their advantage to take the gunmen down. But they actually managed to pull it off really flawlessly, so then they're taken to the airport. Sal was in fact told to keep his gun aimed at the sky. When they arrived at the airport, they sat on the tarmac and a plane came over, and then at a secret signal, the driver grabbed a gun from under the floor mat and shot Sal in the chest, with another officer grabbing John's gun, who gave up immediately, and the hostages all ran out to their waiting families. And the weird moment in the film where the one hostage is like, well, better him than me, and like kisses the driver on the cheek, did in fact happen in real life. The death of Sal in the real event in comparison to the film is very interesting to me, because in the film we have this world-weary man in his late 30s who's kind of a loose cannon and rarely speaks and is seemingly like slightly haunted, and, you know, is murdered for functionally no reason by the FBI, versus real-life Sal, where he was 18 years old. Maybe they thought he was more dangerous because he was an ex-criminal. I don't know how they were able to figure out who he was, because he never participated in any of the outside things. They never saw him. In the film, we see Sonny go back in a lot, being like, I have to stay inside to make sure Sal doesn't blow everybody up. So perhaps that happened in real life too, and so the police thought Sal was more of a liability than he actually was. In interviews after the fact, the FBI officers talk about it like killing a kid is just like a regular day out on the job. John doesn't talk about it at all. It's all very odd and lightly unsettling. And the play also chose to cast an older man as the role of Sal. So I did just want to make sure to point out he was a child who was killed, and it's kind of, that's just like a weird thing that happened. Now, the gay community in particular was kind of baffled by all of this. On one hand, they'd been trying to push the media to talk about gay issues and put gay issues front and center for a very long time. Never successfully. And now they finally were, to a degree where like an address from President Nixon was cut off to switch to footage about the failed heist. But then all of that press about queerness was also directly connected to a crime. One committed by somebody the community generally did not like and thought was mentally unwell to some extent. There were a lot of conflicting emotions here between happiness about seeing media talk about this and gendering a trans woman correctly and talking about something as taboo as gender-affirming surgery and feeling like this was being used as a freak show to sort of ridicule the community. People of all sexualities were also very interested by this sort of reverse macho idea of the heist as a whole, given that the popular understanding of gay men was them being frail, weak sissies, and this was definitely not that. The Gay Activist Alliance met to try to figure out if they would choose to address it at all, and the general consensus was like, probably not, but then a few people pointed out, at the very least, John was at risk of an unfair trial because he was gay, and this would be a way to get eyes on that issue at the very least. So they put out a statement saying they disavow his actions as a community, but would like to call for him to have a true jury of his peers and receive a fair trial. Later, when the film was announced, the gay community called for a boycott pretty much immediately, and generally expressed a lot of concern about how the event would be portrayed, because it did hurt the community to some extent, but it seems like once it came out, it was generally received positively and seen as a really important step forward in representation. There was also just a lot of hurt and complicated feelings around this event overall, and of course they would feel dubious about Hollywood's treatment of it. Also, Paramount was worried that nobody would come to see it if they knew it was a queer movie, so they deliberately hid that in all of the trailers as best they possibly could. Frankly, the Broadway run has functioned similarly. I did not know this was queer at all until I saw other people talking about it after previews had started. But back to the heist. He is stuck to the fact that his motivation for it was funding the operation and or to break Liz out of Kings County Hospital. He switches between the two throughout the entire documentary, but even directly after the fact, when interviewed for the news, Liz said John had absolutely no desire for her to get the surgery, and she did not know anything about this until he said it during the heist. So that story doesn't quite add up. And that's where we get to fold in the secret third thing, which it seems like this was mafia related. And if you know queer history, that may not actually be that surprising in any sense. Also, his name was Little John Bassa, which feels particularly mob-like. If you're not familiar with queer history, the New York City Mafia owned the majority of gay bars historically because they were constantly paying off the police to not perform raids and to look at the other stuff that they were doing, which led to spaces where all kinds of illegal activity could take place. Queer people were also very easy to blackmail because the risk of being outed was still very high, which gave them access to more people they could use for their various crimes because they had dirt on them. Many of the Stonewall era protests, including Stonewall, were specifically around frustration with the mafia's monopoly on the queer world. But anyway, so an article published in the Village Voice shortly after this failed heist talked about how the author knew on good authority from several informants that John was in deep with the mafia, particularly due to his debt from the wedding, but he had also been doing other work for them for some time. Specifically, it's pretty much confirmed that he was an informant within the GAA because he went to every single planning meeting leading up to a protest of Mike Umbers, who was a guy deep in the gay community. He ran multiple fronts for both the Gambino and the Genovese families. The Gambinos ran Stonewall prior to 1969 and then showed up to the protest with a sign that said, "Mike is good," which was not John's smartest moment. My whole thing with this mafia claim is that the story is that the heist had been in the works since April, and the Gambino family already had some beef with Chase Manhattan Bank, so it would track, and Umbers had provided them with at least one of the weapons that they used in the holdup, and Liz actually made an attempt on her life because she had found out about this heist, and she had told him that she would end things if he went through with it, but that all seems kind of implausible to me because John is so clearly not smart enough to successfully pull that off, and so much of this was so haphazardly handled. I would expect the mafia to be like better at what they do than this, but the Mike is good situation highlights that, yeah, he was a really bad choice for this, and he also was definitely involved with the mob. He had apparently been trying to recruit friends for months to join him on this heist, which would explain how he had found some time earlier than this supposed spur-of-the-moment story about when the money would be delivered. The mob was also known for recruiting really young people because they were too young to know what they were getting into and try to stay away from the mafia, which more paints the mafia as a grooming organization than it paints John himself as a grooming person, noting that he was 7 to 9 years older than his two accomplices in this event, one of whom he notably pressured into sex the night before the heist, and in the dog seemed vaguely proud of. So perhaps it is secretly both things at the same time. He seemed to really focus on trying to get with vulnerable people well up until his death. That film is a lightly unsettling watch because it becomes very clear very quickly how unreliable a narrator John is, because his stories over the course of the documentary also don't always line up with one another. He also often talks about how he actually won because he beat the system and Liz survived, not acknowledging the fact that a kid died and Liz ran away from him and he went to prison for a while, but according to him, he's a winner, which felt kind of disconcerting to me. Also, by the time the film was made, he had changed his name once again from Big John to Big Dog in reference to the movie. After John's arrest, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison, serving 5, and then serving 2 more due to violations of parole. He had a very difficult time in prison. He also spent a lot of time bragging about the fact that they were making a movie about him. He had sold the rights to the story to Arts Entertainment Complex, who would then later sell them to Warner for $7,500. Some sources say he also was to receive 1% of the profits from the film. That is not true. I was not able to find anything credible about that being truthful, and he sent a huge chunk of that original money to Liz to pay for her operation. So in a way, the heist did pay for the surgery, just not successfully or as intended. Carmen was paid $50 for her story. She was both very screwed over in her portrayal in the movie and monetarily. Liz was able to get a modest settlement with Warner. I'm not sure how much that ended up being, but she was smart and had her ducks in a row pretty much immediately after the heist. I'm very impressed by her behavior. When the movie came out, John was shown it in private, and then he made them show it to the general population so they wouldn't think he was a liar and because he was proud of it. But the general population concluded from the film that John had actually sold Sal out to the FBI and thus made his life pretty miserable for the rest of his time there. Also, while he was there, he would acquire his third wife, a, by all accounts, cis man named George. They were married in a prison ceremony in 1974. All while John continued to send flowers to Carmen, his first wife. I read in a few places that Liz visited him weekly. I think that was a mix-up of wives, because Carmen definitely visited weekly, as did his mother, who was very boy mom, I support my son no matter what. Though also she had a third son who was disabled and the judge took him away from her and institutionalized him, that she very rarely talks about. Tangent for another day. I think based on Liz's subsequent life, she probably did her best to avoid him and might even have been grateful he was in prison so she didn't have to be stalked by him anymore. And he was released in April of 1987. He then tried to find employment after prison, but that is of course difficult for any person, but especially because his pre-prison skill set was bookkeeping and money handling, and of course he went to prison for a bank heist. He instead sort of descended into trying to profit off of his notoriety, often standing outside of the bank and signing autographs for a few dollars. I don't know anything about the legalities of profiting off of crimes, know how legally dubious this was, but that was what he did. And then he died of cancer in 2006. Liz would finally get her surgery in 1973 and then legally married and later divorced somebody else. She said in interviews that she never loved John and wants nothing more than to be rid of him. She moved to Rochester and became a sex worker later in her life and acquired HIV from a blood transfusion after a car accident and would die of AIDS-related pneumonia in September of 1987. John eulogized at her funeral because he does not know how to leave that poor woman alone even in death. All things considered, I have made the executive decision to view the original heist as unrelated to that of the film because I think the narrative complications of Sonny and Dog Day are a compelling thing to discuss the ethics of his choices and how he treats people, and the real life story is just kind of sad and disconcerting, so that's how I've decided to look at the world. But let's talk about the play, and if it seems like there's a massive tone shift between the last however long it's been and this section, everything from here on was written a week later, and I had feelings about the show. Here's a clip of Bows, and then we're gonna jump into it. My two main compliments right off the bat are that, first of all, the set was really cool. I love me a giant room that rotates and moves around to show you different sides of a building. Broadway has had a dearth of actual sets lately, and it brought me a lot of joy to see the stagecraft used here. It was really well done. The sound design was also incredible, so 10 out of 10 for that.
Another compliment is the sheer amount of Broadway debuts in this cast is absolutely fantastic. I know we've had a lot of discussions, like in the theater world, about the ethics of having really, really famous movie stars come and lead plays and then have them be too expensive for people to actually see it, all of that kind of stuff. But I love that in this particular case, there was the choice to have these famous people at the lead to bring in the money and then bring in lots of people who are like new. I think that's really fun and really cool, and I want to appreciate casting for that.
I will also say that it did sell me on the idea of turning this into a stage play. Near the end of the first act, where we have this moment where Sonny comes out and he like riles up the onlookers outside of the bank, right, and gets us on his side, they decided to put the policeman and the hostage negotiator in the audience, and they turned us into the onlookers. This conceit was used kind of on and off throughout the show, which in my opinion made it really confusing what the scene outside of the bank was supposed to look like, but specifically this moment where he got the entire audience yelling Attica back at him, and we were on the periphery of the police presence was actually kind of moving. I thought that concept was really cool and was a moment that expanded on something that was powerful in the movie that can really only be possible in an in-person theatrical setting, which made me think a lot about the idea of getting us as an audience to root for the little guy and become part of this wave of energy no matter how morally complicated. And kind of like a Here Lies Love way, almost. I also think the moments where they stuck with the more boring, quotidian kinds of conversations going on inside of an active hostage situation created a very interesting balance of tension that if they had committed to that idea the entire time would have made this a really interesting stage adaptation and separate enough from the film that I would say perhaps it would make sense to put it on its feet in that way. I also think the leading actor in particular who played Sonny, John Bernthal, was perfect for this role. He did a fantastic job and was both paying a nice homage to Pacino and was very much himself, which I really loved. I know him for his performance in channel favorite autism movie The Accountant and channel least favorite autism movie The Accountant 2, but apparently he's more famous for The Bear, because that's all anybody in the theater was talking about the entire time before the show. I know so much about such a specific slice of media and very little about anything else. Let me know if it's a show worth checking out, and or if it has disability, then I will definitely check it out. Anyway, so his performance specifically stood out to me. Also, Jessica Hecht as Colleen was absolutely perfect. Everybody else is fantastic as well, to be clear. Those were just the two performances that were really highlighted to me. They're also the two characters that are closest to the source material. And that brings us to the differences between the film and the show. And there were many, enough that I would argue they both followed the same plot shape and had some of the same characters and some of the same tonal pieces to them, but they changed so many things, it arguably feels like a completely different retelling of a vaguely similar story with some of the same people. Like, the difference between when you watch a film adaptation of something and then you watch like the documentary about what really happened right after, where the broad strokes match but most of the small details don't. What I expected going in was that much of the narrative change would be toward making the story more historically accurate because we know so much more about it now, but the majority of changes actually stray even farther from the historical record from the what the film did, nor did they choose to tighten up any loose ends from either version of the story beyond commenting on extradition. Thank you. So I'm not altogether sure what the motivation was for altering things so significantly, but the big things that I noted are as follows. First, they tried to turn into some sort of dark screwball comedy with like joke after joke, which made it very tonally inconsistent throughout because it's really dark, especially because at the same time they further darkened the material. Like, Sal is really trigger happy and constantly stalking around, terrifying the hostages and pointing guns at people. I like that we have more of Sal. I think one of the things with the film is the camera sort of follows Sunny as our protagonist, and we don't often see what Sal is up to over the 14 hours, whereas here they're both visually in the bank at the entire time, but I don't feel like that was utilized to its advantage in any meaningful way. Also, Ray Ray, the name they chose for Stevie, who was Bobby and the guy who bailed at the beginning, they had him stay for a fairly long time, so a lot of Sunny's energy had to be diverted to calming this guy down in the first however many minutes of the robbery. And we also learn that both Sal and Ray Ray are on drugs, which I feel like takes such a sharp tonal character shift from the film that even by this point, Sal is just a completely different person than in the movie. Sunny's character has also changed significantly in that they make him an entirely unintelligent, bumbling idiot with a big heart, for lack of a better way to describe that. Like, in the movie, he's smart and capable, but to a point, and the point becomes his Achilles heel, which makes him feel very human, especially because he's kind and he's careful with his hubris, so you're kind of rooting for him, whereas here you don't really feel anything particular about Sunny as a character, and like, sort of until you get to the Attica moment where he's saying smart things about the establishment in a speech to the audience, but then that feels so out of left field because it doesn't match the level of intelligence we have otherwise seen from this character, which makes the speech feel really out of place in the show itself, because this Sunny would not be saying those things. He's not smart enough to have those thoughts and say them in such an eloquent manner. And then also with the Attica thing, Sunny and Colleen, who's the loud, outspoken bank teller woman, she's named something different in the film, I forget what it is, have an argument where Attica is brought up early on in the play, and I thought that was a really smart choice, actually, because most of the audience members today are not going to, off the top of their head, know about the Attica riots, and that was a smooth way of setting that up. But then, in the moment where he starts yelling Attica outside of the bank, he does so only because Colleen is like, hey, remind them of Attica, they'll be on your side, rather than something he organically comes up with on his own. Al Pacino had this sort of wide-eyed, scared rabbit in a cage sort of vibe to him that the script really didn't make possible for Bernthal, and I felt like he was babied by the words he was saying rather than by the fact he was a scared kid, which undercut Sunny's heart entirely, as did the way and location in which Leon was handled, but I will not get ahead of myself. Also in this version, they had Sunny arrive late to the heist, where like the front doors are locked, and so he has to sweet talk Eddie the security guard into letting him in, which gave space for helpful exposition. This is where we learn that Sunny's a Vietnam veteran and that he's great at sweet talking people, but it feels deeply out of character for Sunny to not be the leader in his own heist, with the three of them going in together. They also tripled the amount of gunshots in comparison to the film, and my sensitive to loud noises brain became very on edge the entire time once I realized that's what they were doing, because I wasn't going to be able to anticipate any of them. I like went in, I was like, this is where the 2 gunshots are in the movie, and then there were more gunshots. But it especially makes you feel so on edge because of how much of the time they're waving around weapons. You never know when a shot is going to go off. In the movie, there were many moments where they just like leave guns on the counter, and everybody is chill with that, which contributed to also softening Sunny's character in comparison to here, because he doesn't have a gun in his hand for most of the movie, whereas in the show he had one in his hand or in his pocket for the majority of the time. That would not have worked in this version because anybody in that room would have grabbed a loose gun and shot Sal immediately if given the chance, but multiple moments of gunshots rather than just the one at the end and the misfire earlier, which included, I believe, Sal shooting Eddie, the security guard, in the shoulder, who then lays in a slowly bleeding, lightly conscious heap for probably around 8 hours of the occupation. And then when the cops first circle, somehow Sal ends up with a graze from a gunshot in his shoulder that they clean and bandage up at some point. This did heighten the feeling of real threat around them all dying because we have 2 gun wounds going on, right? But the thing most famous about this heist is that nobody got hurt and everybody felt incredibly safe the entire time until the end, when Sal was notably weirdly taken out by the FBI for no conceivable reason. So to me, that feels like it also undercuts one of the main points as to why the story is interesting and like notable, not just based on my own opinions of what stood out to me from the source material, but also from what most film scholars specifically talk about when they analyze this film. The majority of points that pop up in every single Film Bro podcast about Dog Day Afternoon did not come to fruition in this version, which I found very frustrating because at that point, like what is there that is cool about this movie that is the reason that we're adapting it? Like, what, if we're taking out all of the things that make it famous, why are we here, if that makes sense? They also changed it from having one hostage negotiator, Moretti, to there being a sort of bumbling guy who isn't sure what to do named Fuko, and then his replacement, who's a hardened, trigger-happy FBI guy who later takes over. Beyond the sheer enjoyment I got from the FBI dude constantly referring to Fuko as I'm not sure why this was split. Like, there were some genius in the long game that Moretti was playing in the original that's now framed as, well, he's being too lenient, so we replaced him with a hard guy, which kind of felt unfair. Fuko also really has to force Sunny into talking to him and starting negotiations, whereas in the movie, Sunny just kind of wants to get out of there, and he's fairly ready to do whatever he can as long as he and the others get out alive. And things like him coming up with the idea to get the crowd on his side, him coming up with the idea of asking for food for everybody inside rather than Fuko telling him that he should have food, or him coming up with the idea to give interviews to the news over the phone, which is cut from this entirely, were where his intelligence and his care for other people really shine through and really give this man a complicated character that we just don't get in this version in the slightest. I feel like I'm comparing it to the movie a lot, and again, I do think adaptations of something to a different medium should have the ability and freedom to expand it out beyond and do something different in relation to the source material. But in this case, most of the changes from film to stage make little sense and less sense than the movie did. So it feels like the movie must be the benchmark as to where the narrative is successful in comparison to it being unsuccessful here. But to be clear, not every adaptation needs to be held directly next to the source material and criticized for its differences. I don't believe that to any extent. I just think if we're telling a story and it is successful in one version, unsuccessful in the other version, that warrants comparison. The one other main difference before we talk about minority narratives is they had the shooting of Sal happen on the way to the helicopter. They used a helicopter instead of a bus. I'm not sure why beyond like the sound design of that is cooler. Instead of the shooting happening at the airport, but that was clearly for staging logistics, so I can accept that change without critique. As much as I think that it's fun that the FBI were hoping they would do a bad job getting into the bus and then getting thwarted again by them being just like good enough at things, it's okay. The change makes sense. I'll get over it. Other specifically minority things to mention, there was a whole section of dialogue that had something to do with Hinduism or a Hindu goddess or something. There was some cue directly before the conversation I was focused on note-taking on, and so I missed the context. I don't know if that conversation was racist or not, and I'm not going to claim that it was because I didn't catch all of it, but I am noting it in case it was and other people have flagged it. There was also a whole bit about the bank manager's wife being Quaker and how he had to convert to marry her, which first of all makes no sense. Quakers, we have like this whole thing about how you cannot ask other people to join the religion or advertise how cool your religion is. And if you were to choose to become a member of the Religious Society of Friends, you are still allowed to be a member of another religion concurrently. We really don't care. So that's not even conversion in the first place. So at the very least, the joke doesn't make any sense. But also in the early 1970s, this would still be well within the living memory of Quakers being some of the only people willing to take care of those disabled by the First World War, and that made them generally off limits to critique as a minority religious group, and that is still something that kind of lasts until this day, which is a weird fact to just know off the top of one's head, but it is the primary reason that Quakers were spared during the Holocaust, and since then have primarily been kind of let alone in the way that other religious minorities often aren't, though I will say they're doing some pretty cool militant work in the UK at the moment. But either way, all of which to say, this joke is really weird. It doesn't matter all that much to the grand scheme of things, but Quakers don't come up in media basically ever, and I was kind of annoyed that literally the only time I've ever heard of Quakerism mentioned in a piece of theater, beyond the fact that I personally know Alice Paul from Suffs was one and is the reason I'm a Quaker, was as the butt of a poorly constructed and largely incorrect joke. Whereas in the film and in history, Sonny outs himself as gay while asking to see his wife, here the news somehow found out about who he was and that he was gay before the phone call could happen, and then put it on the news. And then Sonny chooses to out himself to confirm it, which was followed by a speech that felt incredibly anachronistic about how being gay isn't bad, actually, and there's nothing wrong with it. And that negates any argument that says it would be out of place in the play for them to hold a trans character from 1972 to 2026 standards, because they did that with homosexuality. I mean, it felt super out of place, like it also probably shouldn't have been there, but it's not fair to say, well, why are you mad at the trans character? You want a whole speech about it? That would feel really out of place and too modern, because the script had actually not one but two weird speeches about being gay in it that felt very, very anachronistic. The second weird speech was a stage television interview with a representative from the Gay Liberation Front, whose portrayal felt very on the nose in its portrayal of queerness. Like, the joke is that this man uses gay vernacular and is kind of feminine, and like, oh, it's a queen, not that he was saying anything that was funny, which when placed in a 1970s context felt incredibly homophobic because we were looking at it through both a dated and a comedic lens concurrently. This interview included the gay man calling Sonny an exhibitionist for having married Leon, and goes on a whole rant about how marriage is a heteronormative ideal and the gays are against it, which is a real argument that was happening in the community at the time, and something that was brought into the queer community conversation around the heist specifically.
Historically, within the GAA, whenever they had discussions about the concept of gay marriage, John had been very vocal about wanting gay marriage and wanting to get married. And since he was an outcast, this was just like another thing that kind of added to that pile. So it very much came up in this context historically, not just because we're advertising a gay wedding on TV, but also because specifically this man had been involved in these discussions around gay marriage and how the community felt about gay marriage at the time.
But here it felt like it was used as a sort of punchline about how woke the gays like to be and why can't they be happy about the fact that they can get married now. I didn't love it. It also spoke about how homosexuality is still in the DSM as a mental disorder and how Sonny's not helping the cause by proving his mental deviance with this stunt. And while that fact is technically correct, it is so simplistic about how it is utilized as to arguably be incorrect. Homosexuality was still in the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, if you're not familiar with that acronym. At the time, this is true. The DSM was also not widely utilized among practitioners until it was standardized for the DSM-3 by Robert Spitzer, which began work in 1974 and was published in 1980. The activist work from the queer community to have homosexuality not appear in the DSM-3, and it also did not appear in a slightly updated version of the DSM-2 in 1974, began in the mid to late 1960s and became a very loud movement by 1969, which is 3 years before the show takes place. So having somebody who is a presumed leader of a gay liberation movement use, well, we still categorize it as a mental disorder as a sort of gotcha rather than we are actively trying to get it out of that categorization because this is a massive conversation happening in the community at the time, feels like the script has a fundamental misunderstanding of queer history because that is not a thing that would have been said like that or at that time or by that kind of person in that kind of position. And that makes any well-meaning jokes that are thrown our way about queer people that may mimic something we're seeing in Death Becomes Her or Titanic feel flat and feel inherently like they are laughing at us rather than laughing with us because of the context in which they are coming. Also, the F slur is used a few too many times. Yes, it was historically accurate. I actually feel derogatory language, when used deliberately and historically, is fine and fair game as long as it serves narrative purpose. Again, the example I always use, I think the use of the slurred cripple in Newsies is perfect and it should remain. But every use of the word here felt frivolous and solely like it was for shock value, which is a great way to alienate your queer audience fairly quickly. And speaking of derogatory, I will defend Sonny's first wife's use of freak to describe Leon. I think that works here. I'm not mad at it. What didn't work for me is they kept the Leon reveal until the end of Act 2. Leon is often described as the beating heart of Dog Day Afternoon as a film. She is not on screen for very long, but her existence looms large over the entire thing, and it is through her that we get to see more of who Sonny is as a person outside of this specific situation. Specifically, how much he loves this person, and yet he cannot treat her with any sort of dignity at all, and how complicated of a man that makes him. And also, she's calling him an abuser. We are seeing him just be kind to these people he's pointing guns at, and we're like, who is this guy and do we know him really? Whereas in the first act here, Sonny tells Colleen this robbery isn't for his own personal gain and then asks her if she's ever been in love. And then we don't learn that he's doing it to pay for the surgery until the very end, when like, that's the whole thing that makes him a Robin Hood character and makes him complicated and nuanced and a very messy young man. So to not get that tidbit for the entire time makes it really hard to root for him, like in any capacity really. I was worried they were going to use her arrival as the shock value moment right before intermission. I'm glad they chose not to do that. But its placement at this point in the narrative is also baffling to me. But let's talk about how she is portrayed. And forgive me if I'm a little bit harsh here. I feel very protective over the legacy of people, especially marginalized people largely forgotten by history, and beyond the narrative portrayal itself being incredibly transphobic, I also feel like it's dancing on Liz's grave, and that to me is very disappointing and something I do not have a lot of grace for. So this Leon is brought on and comes across as a petulant, shallow, sex-addicted child. Apparently the reason their relationship is on the rocks is because she is a self-described fucking whore, and at one point while being interviewed by the two FBI men, tries to solicit one of them. And then when she tells Sonny about that and he gets reasonably jealous, she yells about how her nerves can't handle how jealous he gets. As she talks about various trauma from being abused in the past and from the specific visit to Bellevue after trying to take her own life, she gets distracted by the fact that her nails look bad and so now she wants to die again. When Sonny offers to take her to Polynesia, she's like, I can't go to Polynesia, what would I wear? There was also one line where she was like, I'm so scared, Sonny, one minute I'm in Bellevue relaxing and now I'm here and you're in a hostage situation. And the idea of referring to being institutionalized as a trans woman at a time when it was not really viewed as a real thing and subjected you to conversion therapy and shock therapy more often than not, and completely risked your life and well-being and you could be institutionalized for the rest of your life as relaxing for the sake of a joke feels incredibly in poor taste and again detached from any of the realities of queer history. There was also another joke she made about being a mental patient that could have worked, but it was delivered as intended to be like a but-um-ch haha moment for the audience rather than some sort of dark, sardonic way of coping with the reality, which made it an issue. She's also given the option between seeing Sunny or going to jail, and she chooses jail, but it never really explains why this is the case. Unlike in the film where we can tell she is absolutely terrified that Sunny is going to try to kill her, here she continues to blubber on about how much she loves Sunny and she doesn't want to live if she can't be with him, but then at the end of the phone call, inexplicably ends things with him after he says they should renew their vows. They could have had her be all hot and cold with him because he's an abuser who's good at sweet talking and she's just been dragged from a psych ward and is really disoriented, but instead they've decided to portray her as this, I don't want to say histrionic drama queen because histrionic brings up language around personality disorders, which I don't want to do, but something along those lines, as if it's she who's the messy one and Sunny is caught in her orbit rather than what was definitely the other way around. There's also a moment near the end of their phone call where she says, "What's the use of me having the operation if I can't have you?" As if trans women want to medically transition so their boyfriends can find them attractive or something, not because it's basic medical care and is helping with dysphoria, which can be absolutely debilitating. And not only is this portrayal in line with the stereotype of trans women being shallow, sissy, overdramatic princesses who are completely helpless and can't make any decisions, but are also somehow ruining the lives of the people around them because they're so messy, but it's also completely antithetical to who film Leon is and who the real Elizabeth Eden actually was. She was a strong woman trying to get away from a very abusive man who was robbed of all dignity in this moment by being put in front of thousands of spectators, and then the world while still in a hospital gown. In the play, they have her in her own bathrobe and pajama pants and slippers, like they'd pulled her from lounging on the couch at home rather than dragged her from a psych ward, which also changes the tone completely and takes away some of the discombobulation she is narratively allotted by how unput together she looks in the film, which lends to more sympathy towards the character, which we do not get here. Like, maybe Leon and Liz were a little dramatic at times, as any person has any right to be in any situation, but especially this one. But she was not over dramatic about how she was treated and the abuse that she suffered, which is and was well documented. The fact that here they almost even the playing field, saying, "Oh, these two people are both messy, she's more so, cut Sunny some slack," is incredibly unsettling to me, and also doesn't really narratively make any sense, like why she loves him so much but refuses to see him and then breaks up with him, which then settles on her shoulders as her being crazy instead of the fact that this narrative doesn't really make any concrete sense in how they've chosen to write it, which also takes away any depth their relationship might have had for us to see into as an audience. Like, the original film phone call is clearly a well-worn lover spat, where here it doesn't feel that way at all. Especially with the fact that they've added in the idea that Leon was a sex worker, presumably based on the historical fact we've learned in the last decade or so, and thus must be paying attention to the narrative since then in some sense. Or at least I hope that's based in history rather than an intentional utilization of the trans woman as sex worker trope. Ooh, yikes. Let's give it the benefit of the doubt on that one. The play also ends with Leon walking out of the bank towards Sunny in an almost like reuniting in dreams or in the future kind of way. I'm not sure what the narrative intent there was. Leon was wearing teal and one of the women in the bank was wearing teal, so it was unclear who it was, which also like really didn't help that situation. I wasn't 100% sure until I checked Reddit and saw other people discussing it and was confirmed that it was Leon by people sitting closer up, but I could not tell from where I was sitting. But again, either way, I feel like any sort of attempt to make them into a tragic love story beyond the complicated nuance of the film where there are clearly feelings there, but also she needs to leave and they're going different directions, does a complete disservice to Liz's memory and is rather disgusting, frankly, as is using attempts on one's own life as a comedic bit. The misgendering could have worked. I could have been okay with that. I think having Sunny consistently misgender this woman he says he loves more than life itself says a lot about him as a character, but it does not work if every other person on stage is also misgendering Leon as well, which is what was happening here. It was just like, nobody's gendering this character correctly. And so then like, why are we bothering? Any arguments about the transphobia in the show being of the time period also don't hold up here because all of the things I've noted here are completely new in this 2026 play. None of these things appear in the film in any regard at all whatsoever. They are based on well-worn transphobic stereotypes that were around in this era as well. But when we talk about something being of its time and cutting it slack, that should only be in reference to language that is utilized and perhaps a core character narrative that we may not be able to change, which isn't the case here. The original is fine, but in that case, we would expand it out by authentically casting and trying to, with performance of the role within the constraints of the scripts, expand them out to have more inner life than the stereotype in which it was written. None of which this falls into, especially given that it was, again, written very recently. To use Rocky Horror as a more complicated example of a trans narrative, Frankenfurter as a character has a lot of transphobic stereotypes baked into him, and I'm not expecting those to be fixed in the new revival. Why would I? The narrative cannot shift from the original without completely ruining all of the structural integrity of the piece. Nor are they going to change the words to sweet transvestite to be less outdated, and I wouldn't want them to. But what they could do, and probably will, in Sam Pinkleton we trust, is embody them thoughtfully and perhaps take some of the non-scripted things, like stage directions that now carry historical weight to the negative, and replace them with something else, as well as include lots of minority folks in the cast, unlike has been the case historically, to balance that narrative out. And before you go arguing in the comments about Frankenfurter being played by a non-trans person in this version, I think actually in this political climate, having other characters in the show be gender non-conforming and played by trans people and not be the central villain of the piece while differentiating the villain as a different thing is probably a much better move to be making. That's a whole other can of worms we will not get into right now, but since that's also about to be on Broadway and the original film opened in cinemas literally 5 days after Dog Day Afternoon did in 1975, it is worth bringing up in comparison. Rocky Horror is also centering a lot of their marketing around the inclusion of queerness, around conversations around queerness, around outdated pieces of Rocky Horror and what we retain from it, whereas much like the original film, most people don't know Dog Day is queer until they see it. So there is no framing about what is outdated, not that any of it actually is outdated, and what conversations are happening around it with the story like there is for that one, and that gives them even more grace on that show that is not provided here. I also, before we move on, want to mention an experience I had in the theater watching this play last week that felt indicative of we are not ready to handle a complicated stereotype narrative like this with reason and grace right now, which is there were two women to my left, probably their late 40s or so, who when Leon came on stage began whispering to each other, trying to figure out what Leon's deal is. And then finally one woman slapped the other in the arm and went, "Oh, it's a tranny." And the other woman like nodded in agreement with like delight, clearly glad to have figured it out. And then they both went on watching the show. And I don't think I've ever felt such a strong need to get up and run out of a theater in my entire life. And to me that said two things. One, the intended age group audience for this play does not know enough about trans people to be able to handle such a messily written trans character without internalizing every single stereotype and not realizing it's a stereotype. And two, we are not safe here, and we are not expected to be here. This show is not meant for queer people. It was not made for us in mind in any capacity beyond the fact that we have to be included because I guess it's in the plot, and also maybe we can make it funny if we think hard enough about it. And if you have created a space where women feel comfortable just saying slurs about a certain group of people, something has gone horribly wrong. Like something is incorrect. A primary thing that came up over and over again in the original Reddit thread that started this whole project is the idea of why here, why now, which first of all ignores the fact that 2025 is the 50th anniversary of this legendary film, so that in and of itself honestly feels like good enough reason to warrant the here and now. But also watching the film, I was entirely with the why am I watching this today. We are having the same issues around police brutality and lack of trust in the officials who are allegedly supposed to protect us today as we were then. Similar economic climate, similar weird feelings about war going on, though it was stronger back then because Vietnam had a draft, similar agitation around the rights of minority groups and the media being happy when it turns out a criminal is in a minority so they can use that to freakify and vilify them, and activist groups for that minority not knowing how to handle the situation, and the idea of rooting for the little guy, the sort of Robin Hood character who's doing something stupid because he feels like he doesn't have any other choice. All of this is very similar to the climate we find ourselves in today. And because the movie is such a unique story told in a very human-focused documentary style way, it really stands the test of time. So the why here, why now for the movie, I'm with. Why here, why now for a theoretical stage adaptation of the movie, I am also with. Why here, why now for this specific version of a stage adaptation, I'm just not following. Because most of what made the film relevant and important politically, both then and now, is either changed significantly or altogether removed from this version. So then we're just left with like, it's an interesting story rather than it's a meaningful story, and I feel like that removes all point and purpose from it to some extent. In addition to the choice to vilify and make jokes around trans and gay people in this particular political climate, in fact, just to tell a trans story without seemingly hiring any sort of dramaturg or DEI consultant in 2026 is a little bit wild to me. I will also say there were a bunch of other anachronisms in the show. I'm not going to go into that because I was note-taking other stuff, so I don't have examples off the top of my head, but I've been doing a lot of academic work around stuff in the 1970s over the past few months. If you see my Instagram story, you might have some ideas what I'm working on. You'll learn about it in a year or two. But anyway, some of what appeared in the show was glaring in its historical inaccuracy if you know anything about the 1970s, and a dramaturg would have flagged and fixed that. And then we also have this specific trans narrative as written without seemingly any formal minority input in the specific political climate around trans people. What are we we doing here? This is a terrible idea. Like, I'm so glad they put in the effort to cast trans people as the Leon and as Leon's understudy, but an actor should never be put in a position where they also have to do scholar work or point out a narrative flaw in something. I'm not saying these actors were or were not put in that position. I have absolutely no idea, but this idea of we can just cast authentically and then create the story with an all cis creative team and it's going to be fine doesn't work, because they were hired to be an actor, not a consultant, and if they were to speak up about any issues with narratives, they might be seen as hard to work with, especially if this is their Broadway debut, which I believe is the case for both of them, but don't quote me on that. I also would not expect an actor to have the knowledge and training required to have nuanced conversations around minority media narratives, because that's not what they're there to do. That's not what their career is. I'm not expecting them to have academic training on what trans narratives are supposed to look like. I mean, I will say, as somebody who has academic training on other minority narratives, it helps me as an actor to be conscious of what I'm doing, but it's not something I'm going to expect from anybody in this field. That's not their job. It's the difference between hiring a disabled person to tell you how to make a disability look realistic on stage and hiring a disability dramaturg who can tell you how to make the character feel like a human person who happens to be disabled and also doesn't add to the wider canon of harm against us. And the majority of time where you do see actors stepping into a scholar position concurrently, they're negotiating writers' fees, or at least I hope they are. This is more common in film and TV than it is in theater, but many of my friends have writing credits on the shows they've acted in because of their input and gotten extra pay because they are helping to write the script, and that is a separate job. But regardless, anybody in that position in any field should be compensated separately from their acting salary because it is a different job. But it's therefore the responsibility of the creative team to add a member to it whose job is to interface with the writers and the director to iron out narrative issues and act on behalf of the minority folk in the room so they don't have to do it themselves to keep them safe and to keep the story safe. Because those people should not be put in that position at any point or have to worry about what if I am put in that position. The Harriet Tubman effect, for example, is often hired on Broadway shows in this sort of position. Like, this idea is not rare or unheard of anymore. If you open a playbill that has minorities in the show right now, Harriet Tubman effect is usually mentioned. So that's the piece of this whole puzzle that I find the most baffling, especially because they made the narrative choice to add so much extra about queerness and change so much about this trans character. And I feel like the logical extension of that thought process is like, oh, maybe I should have somebody in the community check this to make sure that it's okay. And maybe that did happen, but maybe it was just like, you know, a yes man kind of friend or something like that. But the fact that it doesn't seem like that happened on a larger scale, on an academic scale, with somebody in the rehearsal room is where I feel the root of all of the series issues settle themselves. I always joke this series needs to be retitled Hire a Dramaturg, We Fix All Your Problems for You, but specifically in this case, it is true. It probably would have prevented a lot of the active harm that is being caused by this narrative right now, and also the other flaws with the play. In a world where I had the power to change things, I do think that the big issue with the piece overall was the choice to turn it into a comedy, because that require significant things to laugh at, which turns all of your characters into archetypes unless you're incredibly careful not to do that, and it's very difficult, and turning things that should be serious into a joke, which is normally fine, albeit tonally different from the movie throughout, until we get to important minority discussions where it would have felt like a weird shift in tone if they handled them with care because it wouldn't match up with the rest of the show, and the requirement of comedic archetype automatically harms our minority characters the most. The film is initially funny, not so much in a laugh out loud sense, and more of a these circumstances are wild sense, and then it becomes more serious as the piece goes on and you get to know the characters better. What is comedic is not the fact that they're in minorities or that they're saying funny things all the time. It's that they're just smart enough, but just inept enough to do a really weird job at trying to pull off a heist, and that created some even weirder situations. And I think following that framing here would have also been quite successful. There's a lot of comedy to pull from this material. I just generally found that what comedy was pulled and expanded upon to make comedy undercut the humanity of the characters on the stage or of wider minority groups, which felt entirely unnecessary and hurt its own material. I also think they really needed to figure out how Sunny was going to be portrayed as good, bad, or complicated, and then make more deliberate choices around that in association with how Leon is treated both by him and by everybody else. And there very easily could have been a note in the playbill about outdated language to accompany the piece. Not that all that much outdated language is used in the piece in the first place. The issue was largely narrative rather than word choice. But in the case of misgendering at the very least, and maybe a little history about queerness at the time, that could have been a great little note to put in there. They totally could have done that. They had a performance advisory, which is like a content warning, posted on just about every single service in the theater. I'll put a picture of it on screen right now. I really appreciated this. This is great. I mean, they did it because they legally have to, but I still appreciate it. At the very least, these can sometimes be hard to find in a theater. It's usually just like one sign and that's all you see. They were everywhere. But I will note that this performance advisory somehow completely forgets to note content warnings for discussions of trying to off oneself and homophobia. The latter, I sort of understand. The former is a bit baffling to me. To remember to mention a warning for references to drugs and alcohol that happened twice, but forget that a woman's attempt on her own life is a really important plot point is kind of fascinating to me. But perhaps because that information was delivered in the show via joke, they thought maybe it didn't need to be warned for, I'm not sure. But I rambled long enough. It's been many hours. I hope that you've learned something today. I again could not recommend the movie enough. Please go watch it. It's a very unique experience and I wouldn't have looked into it at all otherwise, but I'm very glad that I did. Feel free to stick around. We are going to be talking about another oddly recent for the content of its minority narrative Broadway show in 2 weeks, and then the disability history of Girl Scouts a week or two after that. We have fun here. Let me know your thoughts down below, especially if you've seen the show and or movie and or both. And as always, thank you for being here. Thank you for being. Remember, critical thinking is really sexy and so is hiring dramaturgs, and I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.